Gentlemen, my name is Jack Batten, and I am a junior at the college serving as Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Junior Program here at Yale. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's debate on Resolve Global Order Needs U.S. Power. Now, before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley Program. The William F. Buckley Junior Program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We've hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Over 750 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also want to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression, as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Please also note that this event will be recorded and live streamed. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of free speech. Now for our guests. Dr. Hal Brands is the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is also a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He is the author or editor of several books, including most recently, The Eurasian Century, Hot Wars, Cold Wars, and the Making of the Modern World. Dr. Brands has served as Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning and lead writer for the Commission on the National Defense Strategy for the United States. He is a member of the State Department's Foreign Affairs Policy Board and consults with a range of government offices and agencies in the intelligence and national security communities. His writings have appeared in Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and other outlets. He received his BA in History and Political Science from Stanford and a PhD in History from Yale. Michael Brenes is co-director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and a lecturer in history at Yale University. His research interests include United States foreign policy, political history, and political economy. He is the author of For Might and Right, Cold War Defense Spending and the Remaking of American Democracy, and the co-editor of Rethinking U.S. Power, Domestic Histories of U.S. Foreign Relations, published in 2024. His next book, co-authored with Van Jackson, is titled The Rivalry Peril, How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy, and will be published by Yale University Press in January 2025. In addition to his academic articles and book chapters, his work has been published in the New York Times, the New Republic, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy, among many other publications. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Now, just a note on format, we will begin with opening statements from each guest, starting with Dr. Brands, and then they will each give brief rebuttals, and then we'll move into a fairly extensive period of Q&A. So please be thinking of questions as the guests speak. Without further ado, Dr. Brands, could you take us off?
Awesome. Thanks, Jack, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So thanks to the Buckley folks for hosting us here, and Mike, it's good to see you again. So. Just sort of spoiler alert, we kind of know each other and like each other, so we're going to keep the personal insults to a minimum here. Okay, so the question is whether American power is indispensable to global order, and my answer would be yes, if the question is whether American power is indispensable to a global order that we might actually want to live in. There could be other imaginable global orders that emerge without U.S. power. There could be a Chinese-run order, for instance. But I don't think those of us who like free speech and democracy and basic security would like that order very much. And so to unpack that, let me just make 4 brief points. The first point is that by any meaningful comparison, the last 80 years, the period since 1945, has been the best 80 years in human history. There has been no great power war during that period. There has been no global depression during that period. Democracy and respect for human rights have spread further than ever before. Living standards have soared as trade has flourished. State death, when a country gets wiped off the map by its larger, stronger neighbor, has become very rare. To be sure, lots of awful things have happened. Every age is a story of injustice in one way or another. But if you compare the last 80 years not to paradise, but to any other comparable length period in human history, it looks pretty darn good. That's point 1. Point 2 The period since 1945 has also been the period of American primacy. It's been the age of American power. The U.S. came out of World War II with unrivaled power. That power has ebbed, it's waxed and waned since then, but the U.S. has consistently been the most powerful and most active state in the system since then, especially when American power is combined with the capabilities of U.S. allies. And so this great period in human history has also been this period of tremendous American influence on the global scene. And I suppose you could argue that's a coincidence, but I don't think that's the case. And this leads to my third point. A lot of factors have gone into human and global flourishing over the past 80 years, but U.S. power and U.S. strategy have been at the center. Because the United States deliberately went out and tried to craft a global order that would bring these good results about. It led an international trading system that linked like-minded nations together. It created alliances and military strategies that were meant to deter aggression in key regions around the world. It prevented dangerous autocratic actors like the Soviet Union from reordering the system. It promoted, not always consistently and not always effectively, democratic values, first in places like Europe and Japan after World War II, and then more broadly. And it just kind of maintained a balance of power in which good things could happen. And so the U.S. has made tons of errors over the past 80 years. We can all come up with our favorite list of them. But broadly speaking, it put its power behind the concept of order that I've described. And that leads to my final point, which is simply that that order is in danger today. It's in danger because autocratic actors are challenging it. It's in danger because it's not clear that the U.S. is committed to it anymore. But I guarantee you we're going to miss it when it's gone, because the last 80 years have been a period of tremendous human flourishing.
Can we clap for Hal? Or? Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Will. Thanks to the Buckley Institute. It's a great pleasure to be here with Hal. As Hal said, we are good friends. I consider him a good friend and a good scholar. So we're not gonna again get personal here. I think actually Hal is right, or Hal and I agree on a variety of different issues, including the fact that the U.S. can play an affirmative role in global order, but the vision of U.S. power that currently exists that would be, I think, contributing to meaningful world order is not the one we have. And I think the version of U.S. power that we have, or the one that we've had over the past 25 to 30 years, is the one that I take issue with tonight. And that is, as Hal said, the role of the United States in terms of shaping global primacy, or the drive to global primacy that the United States has embarked upon over the past 25 to 30 years. I don't actually take issue with the central premise of the debate or prompt tonight, that the United States can play an excellent role, an affirmative role in global power, that the world needs that the global order needs U.S. power. But I do take issue with primacy in terms of how primacy has materialized on the global stage. And I'll just make 3 points about this in terms of why primacy won't work in the current conditions we face globally. First, primacy is impossible in a multipolar world, which is what I increasingly think we're moving toward. We're moving toward a world where over the next 20 years, we're going to see 3 major economic powers influence the world, that is the United States, India, and China, with a series of other actors like Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa influencing global GDP as well. This is while China controls key areas of economic production that will shape the 21st century, particularly on climate change, which is going to be, I think, a key, obviously, issue going forward in the 21st century. Just a few statistics to hammer home this point. China is projected to control 45% of global manufacturing. By 2030, it controls climate-related technologies, 80% of the world's solar panels, 70% of lithium-ion batteries, access to strategic minerals, on and on. The United States is not in a position to catch up to China on these fronts, which, again, I think signal the future of the world in terms of economic production and modernity, as Adam Tooze has signaled towards this. This is to say that the United States also will not, the United States won't be able to catch up to China, but also China won't be able to catch up to the United States, I think, in a lot of its areas in terms of AI, and the fact that the United States will be a dominant player on the global stage, that it will have a significant role to play in economic affairs. American dominance in terms of many issues economically is not going to go away, but the United States will not have the same influence it had during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. There won't be a Pax Americana, but there also won't be a Chinese century, to allude to Kyle Chan and some things he has said. This leads me to my second point, which is that much of the world, particularly nations in the global south, do not want to be subjected to U.S. primacy, or don't want to choose, for that matter, between the United States and China in the global system. The reality is that there are many countries in the world who will remain fence-sitters, quote-unquote fence-sitters, like India, like South Africa, like many other BRICS nations, who want to engage in transactional terms with the great powers and, for that matter, among themselves. And we saw this quite clearly over Ukraine and other issues. The Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, is a Chinese project that is obviously exerting Chinese power globally, influence globally, but is also a transactional project that many nations around the world want to benefit from, again, on transactional terms. So does India, so does the Philippines, Indonesia, Kenya, Nigeria, I could go on and on. This, I think, creates a series of problems in terms of the fact that there is no values-based system in the world right now. I'm writing a piece on foreign affairs about this, so you are all my peer review audience for this. But the ultimate idea is that the United States will not see a liberal world order that is a US-led liberal world order anytime soon, and prosperity will not come solely through the ends of economic and military power from the United States. And this leads me to my third and final point, is that the American people actually do not want a strategy of US primacy or a strategy premised on primacy. American people don't want power in these terms. And we saw this quite clearly, I think, during the last presidential election. 56% of Americans said that the US should play an active role in global affairs. That's actually the lowest number in recent history in terms of how these polls have been taken. A majority also said the United States is too involved in global affairs and that the United States should pull back from the world stage. I would argue that Donald Trump profited from this milieu. You saw this in 2016, 2020, and most recently in 2024. In fact, Donald Trump at the UN the other day said he ended 7 unendable wars. The facts might be dubious on that, but the ultimate idea is that the United States, as he sees it, or Americans are going to respond positively to his idea that he is a peacemaker and that the United States wants to be out of foreign wars. And this is why only a third of Americans, which I thought was quite surprising when I came upon this statistic, only a third of Americans see China as an enemy, with most wanting to avoid an armed conflict, concerned how China will affect, of course, their jobs and livelihood, but ultimately wanting to avoid a conflict over Taiwan, sending their kids to good schools, etc. So I will stop there with the idea that the United States needs to prioritize its interests, rethink its role on the world stage, and limit its power. So I will turn things over to Hal now.
Two minutes, is that right? All right. So I agree with a lot of the diagnosis of the problem that Professor Brenes just argued. But I think it leads me to a slightly different place. So let me explain what I mean by that. It's totally true that the world is more balanced today than it was in the mid-1990s. We can have a good debate about whether there's true multipolarity or not, but we're no longer in the very heady condition of unipolarity that existed in 1990. So one statistic, in 1995, the US and its core treaty allies accounted for 80% of global military spending and 75% of global GDP. Things have obviously changed quite a lot since then. But for me, the question is not so much, does the international system need a certain level of American dominance to continue? It's, does the international system need American power to be applied in a constructive, engaged, and sometimes assertive way? And I think the answer is clearly yes, because you can go around the world, and it's true that the United States needs more from its allies these days, but the allies still need American power. If you go to Europe, there is not yet a Europe that is capable of balancing Russian power and Russian aggression by itself. If you go to the Middle East, it's only the United States that can play sort of the convening role in getting countries like Israel and some of the GCC, the Gulf Arabs, together and pushing back against Iranian influence. And if you go to the Indo-Pacific, there's not even a theoretical coalition that can balance Chinese power without the engagement, without the military power, without the diplomatic convening power of the United States. That's true on a host of economic and technological issues as well. And so it's true that American power is no longer as impressive as it might have been 30 years ago, but it's not any less important in terms of upholding a tolerable concept of international order.
I'll just start with a couple points that Hal made at his opening remarks and say, I think ultimately the fact that the United States has not seen, or the world has not seen, a great power war obviously is a good thing, but obviously also the United States and the world is seeing an increase of global conflicts around the world, and that is, I think, due to the fact partly due to the fact, again, that the United States is not able to achieve what it wants on the world stage, and that primacy has not achieved its ends. In terms of the balancing of relationships and alliances, I think, again, there's some truth to that. I think Hal's right. I don't disagree with him on that front. But the question is, again, to what ends? The balance of alliances and balancing of relationships in Asia and Africa is to what end? And I think my overall point would be that the United States has not prioritized what those ends are in a multipolar world. What do we want from those alliances? What do we want from how we're interacting on the world stage, not just in terms of security in the Indo-Pacific or in Ukraine, but also on other issues of transnational concern like climate, et cetera. I think, to me, the question is what U.S. power can be, as Hal posed at the outset of his remarks in terms of a vision of a world that we all want. What U.S. power can be, I think, is open to great contestation and fluidity. I think it's actually a great moment to have these kinds of conversations, but I don't think that the United States is going to be able to achieve the ends that it wants to achieve, given what we've seen as the results so far over the past, again, 25 years, and going forward in the age of Donald Trump and what he's done to shape foreign policy. I think that becomes increasingly difficult to kind of see how the U.S. can exert its influence on a global stage and create the ends that it wants to achieve, given, again, also this is a multipolar world. So I will stop there.
Yeah, well, thank you both very much. I'll just start us off with a quick question. Now, I think you both agree that global order is much preferable to global disorder, as it were. What do you each think is the biggest threat to global order? Dr. Brenes, maybe you could start.
So the biggest threat to global order today is the fact that you have increasingly powerful and increasingly energetic states that reject some or all of the system that has sort of provided a decent concept of order in the world for at least the past 3 decades and probably the past 8 decades. And I'm talking about the Russias and Chinas and Irans and North Koreas of the world. And they don't all want exactly the same thing, and they don't all reject a US-led order or a rules-based order or whatever you want to call it to the same degree. The Russians reject it much more violently and vehemently than the Chinese do, for instance. But they all want to bring about a very different sort of concept of international society, one in which balances of power in key regions are reshaped, one in which international norms are reshaped, one in which understandings of human rights are reshaped, one in which the reach of democracy and human rights is considerably rolled back. And so they're all aspiring to a pretty fundamental change in the way the world works. And for me, that's the greatest threat there is.
I think the greatest threat in terms of how I'd see the world is the existential threat of climate change. I think that's quite clear that the United States and the world is facing, yes, a threat in terms of regional issues and regional security, but climate change is going to affect us all in ways that we have yet to see materialize, and it's already materializing. Climate change is wreaking havoc faster than we expected, and there's not an appropriate response or strategy from the global community to deal with it. And I think this is also compounded by the fact that we're living, as I've argued in other places, in an age of nationalism where parochialism and nationalism has taken over multilateralism or minilateralism even, that would allow cooperation to achieve the ends we want to achieve as it relates to climate. I mean, I hate the prioritization question in terms of like what's most important, because there's lots of issues that are important. I would obviously throw Ukraine in there and security in the Pacific, but if we're looking at in terms of global threats that's going to affect us all, I would say it's a threat of climate change. That's, again, the top of a list that can be very long.
Dr. Brenes, I have one question for you. Now, Dr. Brenes, in his opening remarks, he talked about some polls and statistics that show that a majority of Americans don't want to be deeply involved in a lot of foreign conflicts, a lot of they don't want the U.S. to be the global hegemon that it has been for a long time. Do you think this is true? Do you think America wants to be the primary global power? And if it doesn't, then like, what should it do going forward?
Yeah, so Americans are ambivalent about the role they play in the world. They like the power to shape the world, and they don't like to pay the cost. And that's not unusual. People have conflicting and divergent preferences. It's also not unusual historically. Americans have always been ambivalent about this role. And go back and look at the debates the Truman administration had over the formation of NATO and providing aid to Greece and Turkey and the Marshall Plan. And you'll find that they were always terrified of the fact that Americans were going to reject the notion that the U.S. should play this utterly unique, unprecedented role in global affairs, taking a certain amount of responsibility for the well-being of people and countries thousands of miles away. And that was persistent throughout the Cold War. And so in the 1970s, there were polls indicating that only a third of Americans thought that the United States should fight to defend West Germany, its crucial European ally. And so typically, American policymakers understood this, and most American policymakers believed that it was their job to be out there affirmatively making the case for why these commitments were ultimately in America's economic and security interest. And that is one thing that I think has changed quite significantly over the past 10, 15, 20 years, where we've seen a series of presidents, not just Donald Trump, really lean more into the notion that it's time for the United States to adopt a more restrained posture in world affairs. And I think that is starting to filter through into the public opinion as well.
All right, just one more question for me, and then I'll open it up to all of you. But Dr. Brenes, I don't know, this is kind of an enormous question, and you can kind of, punt on it if you want to. But
I'll try my best.
Yeah, what does a global order without the U.S. at the front look like? Is it kind of like a UN style of like group governance? Do we, work to have more like multilateral treaties? What does intervention in conflicts look like going forward? What does this look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, as I said, the United States, I think, will continue to play a leading role in global affairs. I don't think, the United States' economic power or military power, certainly not military power, is going away anytime soon. But I think what you're going to have are essentially three powers, India, China, and the United States, influencing global order in ways that we have not seen over the past 80 years, more than that. And I think what's going to happen, therefore, is that the United States, to quote and paraphrase Emma Ashford's new book, First Among Equals, the United States can play a first among equals role in shaping world order to the benefit of global peace and prosperity. I think, again, Hal and I are on the same page in terms of what we want to see around the world, which is democracy, human rights, rule of law flourish. It's just the question of how to achieve that and within the structural limitations that we're facing. And I think that the United States is going to increasingly confront the fact that these structural limitations are going to compound upon each other. And they're going to have to adopt a new strategy and adapt accordingly in ways that I think, again, lead towards a first among equals type of mindset that allows, as you said, opportunities for new cooperation, new multilateralism, new engagement with both our allies and adversaries on certain issues.
Thank you. All right, questions from all of you? Yeah. Just please stand and briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Chris Campbell. I'm at the Divinity School. I suppose a question I'd have is if we are having some sort of like push into like global power and sustaining global power or expanding global power, if there is a kind of tie between this idea of democratic rule as kind of the end that we want to reach, on a global level, is there kind of a draw towards increasing U.S. global power almost in an imperial way again, where we're kind of forcing people into a more direct union like we would have had, like we did have with the states in their unification?
Hal, you want to?
Oh, yeah, sure, I'll take that one. Yeah, so we live in a strange time when the U.S. president is talking about, adding territory, perhaps forcibly, from Canada and Panama and Greenland. And let's throw Gaza in there just for the fun of it. But what that may make us forget, actually, is that the U.S. has been, I don't have any quarrel with the idea that the U.S. has exerted a form of quasi-imperial influence over the past 80 years. I mean, you look at the structure, the network of military alliances and so on and so forth, and and it's hard to call it anything else. But what's interesting about it is that the U.S. has been asked to exert that influence by the countries that participate in those networks. And so it's interesting, if you look at Ukraine, which Mike mentioned, Ukraine is desperate to join the American empire. It is desperate to get into NATO because it sees that as protection against a real imperialist power, which will conquer its land and rape its women and murder its men, and the way that we sort of associate with the worst forms of imperialism. And so yes, the United States exercises influence on a scale that's comparable to many empires, but as sort of an old historian put it, it's been empire by invitation, because so many countries around the world have seen American influence as being vastly preferable to the other models on offer.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, which is that what we're increasingly seeing is that there's a effort to move American foreign policy into a 19th century style foreign policy in a multipolar world, and therefore those two things cannot happen. They cannot align. And so the conflicts arise out of that, I think, ultimately, in terms of what can be done and the disastrous results that can flow from there. And I'll just sort of put a pin on what, or put a fine point on what Hal said. I think, right, there's lots of issues we can point to, and Ukraine being one of them, in terms of, you know, what that means, or the fate of Ukraine means, if we're trying to pursue a 19th century style foreign policy in a multipolar world where security issues in Europe, I think, are one of our concerns.
Thank you. More questions?
Hi, I'm Nico. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a school management student. I'm curious, and it kind of goes to what I think was in Jack's question to you as well. This idea of these international institutions, do they have legitimacy? Thinking of the UN, World Health Organization, do they have the legitimacy to carry out true mission-oriented work, absent U.S. participation as a global power that's exerting its strength behind it?
Yeah, no, I actually think this is perhaps where Hal and I agree, is that the United States is needed on these fronts, right? And I mean, it needs to, again, adopt a new approach to engaging with these multilateral institutions. And it can't be, I think, what Trump did, you know, a couple of days ago. And it has to be, therefore, I think the United States recognizing that it cannot achieve what it wants to achieve or could achieve during the post-Cold War period, or Cold War period, really, because the end of the Cold War, you saw, I think, a neglect of multilateral institutions, because in the era of primacy, you don't need to tend to them, because democracy and human rights will flourish through American military and economic power, and that didn't happen. So now we're reaping the consequences of that. And I think to understand how productive actually these multilateral institutions can be to a new world order, a multipolar world order, the United States should be re-engaging with them on issues like climate, on issues like pandemics. You know, don't pull out of the World Health Organization. That's, you know, first thing I wouldn't do. But engaging on better terms with countries in the global south, knowing that we need also them to be partners if we're going to see, again, democracy and equality and greater stability flourish.
Hi, my name is Amelia, and I'm at Yale College. And I had a question on climate change. So right now, U.S. has a very volatile view on climate change. Like right now, the DOE just published a report basically saying that climate change is non-existent. So when we're talking about big structures like the UN, how will they sort of achieve, you know, help spread this message without the U.S. like backing, when the U.S. itself doesn't understand what it has, like what's its view?
Okay.
Yeah, look, I would say climate change is a very good example of an issue that is ultimately going to be very difficult to solve without, or not solve is the wrong word, adapt to without American engagement and some degree of American leadership, which is one of the reasons why I would agree with Mike, that I think it's a problem when the U.S. sort of absents itself from these processes, because one of the roles that the U.S. has played over the past 80 years is not just sort of throwing its own weight around on issue, but acting as the convener of collective action and solving common problems, right? And maybe that problem in the 1940s was European destitution after World War II, and maybe that problem in the early 2000s was proliferation and terrorism, and maybe the problem today is climate. You put them all together, and the common thread is that you're not going to get much meaningful action without the engagement of the world's most powerful actor. And I would actually extend that to a whole range of transnational issues, right? Whether it's pandemics or shaping the emergence of AI and advanced technologies. You know, the question is really, what role is the United States and what role are other powerful actors going to play in that? And so I think you don't necessarily have to sort of agree with the current policies that the U.S. is pursuing to understand the importance of American involvement in these issues.
Here.
Hello, my name is Conrad Gorski. I'm a graduate student from Canada. I have a question for both of you. I'm working on a history of Western hegemony, and I've come across arguments which assert that Western consumption requires a very kind of repressive primacy because there isn't enough resources to go around. I'm wondering if both of you think there aren't enough resources to go around, and do Western standards of consumption require a repressive primacy? I've seen this argument with George Kennan that we have to deal with hard power concepts. He wrote some memo, I think 1948, 1949, that we can't afford the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. So I'm wondering, is this the case, that Western standards of consumption requires repressive primacy?
You want to go first?
Oh, yeah. So, sure. Sorry. Is my mic okay? Okay. You know, I think we are living in an age of abundance already. You know, I think the United States, to paraphrase, anyway, you know, the problem is not scarcity in terms of productivity. The problem is not scarcity in terms of ingenuity. I think the problem is that resources are unevenly distributed around the world. And that I would include, if we're talking about this in terms of security terms, I would talk about strategic minerals. I put strategic minerals in there in terms of the fact that China controls the manufactured production of strategic minerals. That China controls, you know, a significant portion of, I think, as kind of Adam Tooze said, you know, modernity. And I think the question, therefore, is like, what is the rest of the world going to do about this? And we can adopt a competitive stance about it. We can say, let's put them down so we can build ourselves up, or we can recognize that that's not going to work, and at least to the full extent that we might want it to, and approach global problems with a new focus and a new strategy that recognizes that the problem is not necessarily scarcity, it's how resources are unevenly distributed.
Yeah, so this critique is a new version of an old idea, kind of the dependency theory concept from the 60s and the 70s, which basically argued that, you know, hegemonic power and American power required keeping other states in a condition of underdevelopment. And I just don't see a huge amount of empirical evidence for that. And so if you look at the 25 years after World War II, the United States invested huge amounts of its own money in rebuilding countries in Europe and East Asia as economic competitors to the United States. You know, America's share of global GDP went from 50% in 1945 to about 20% in the early 70s, and American leaders counted that as a victory because it helped countries like West Germany and Japan get on their feet and led to sort of a better balance of power in the free world's favor. And it's also worth, you know, remembering that the United States kind of invented foreign aid as we know it today, which is, again, one of the reasons why I think it's troubling that the United States is stepping back from foreign aid in such a significant way. And so it's true that American foreign policy is first and foremost about the well-being of the American people and the prosperity of the American people. But one of the things that has historically made American leadership attractive is that the U.S. has pursued a pretty broad view of its own self-interest and has basically operated on the principle that we can do well by helping people who think like us do well. And that has been, I think, a pretty positive sum approach to international affairs.
Hi, I'm Ethan. I'm a first-year MPP student. I'm wondering, essentially, like, how can we encourage multilateralism, sort of be the first among equals without resorting to, like, appeasement? I'm just thinking, like, our current UN system is designed so that the Security Council has countries like Russia who have veto power and can block resolutions on North Korea or even on their invasion of Ukraine. So how can we sort of encourage multilateralism while preventing other countries from taking advantage of that?
Sure. I mean, I'll just answer briefly on that. I mean, the sort of the odd, the incongruity we confront when we think about sort of the idea that the U.S. is resistant to multipolarity is that it's not actually the United States that's standing in the way of reform of the UN Security Council. The United States has said for about 15 years now that it thinks India should have a permanent seat on the Security Council. And who's not in favor of it? Russia's not in favor of it, and China's not in favor of it, because this is a major source of their diplomatic sway in international affairs. And so I think it's really important for the functioning of international organizations in general, whether it's the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, you name it, that sort of the distribution of authority within these institutions gradually shift so that it reflects the 2025 balance of power as opposed to the 1945 or the 1939 balance of power, as is sometimes the case with the UN Security Council. And this is an area where I think, you know, the United States in some areas has done worse than others, but it's actually been more forward-leaning than a lot of other leading states in the system.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. My name is Tyler. I'm a senior at Yale. And I'm curious, I have a question for you, Dr. Brenes. You talk about the U.S. being kind of first among equals or leading amongst equals, especially on the issue of climate change. I agree with you. This is a major problem, probably the major problem of the century. I would be curious how we can lead among equals as we see China being more and more authoritarian at home and in the South China Sea, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan. How can we lead among equals? How can we be equals with China when they pursue expansionist policy in their own backyard? India obviously does not want this. I think that is a much more pressing security question to the United States than climate change is. And if you ask Americans, I think they would agree with you.
Yeah, a great question. I don't believe it's equals in terms of we're going to behave like them or we're trying to align our governmental systems. Like, that's obviously not the case. I mean among equals in the sense of economic power, right? Relative economic power. And I think there are obviously clear tensions that the United States and China are not going to be able to resolve. I would argue that China does pose a series of threats to democracy, to stability. But the question is then, do you pursue those threats or do you try to deter those threats through a military posture or military strategy that won't achieve the ends you want in terms of getting the grand strategic picture right? Which is another way of saying, I think that there are a series of questions that we have not raised or concerns we have not raised about what are our ends in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, right? What do we want to see? Do we want to see a China down and a U.S. up? Do we want to see the collapse of the Chinese economy? Do we want to see the collapse of Xi Jinping's regime? I think then within that series of questions, I think they demand an answer in terms of creating effective strategy. And then from there, we can understand sort of the bigger picture, develop a bigger strategy or more cohesive and coherent strategy that can deal with engagement with China on other issues, like climate, which I do think, you know, China's leading the world in terms of climate technology. That's not gonna stop. China sees its future through and its economic future through climate that's not going to stop the United States, I think, has to reckon with that in some capacity.
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm a senior in the college. Dr. Brenes' argument seems to imply that the multipolar future is somewhat inevitable. I just wanted to ask Dr. Brands if you believe that that's true, or if the U.S. has the capacity to regain some of the hegemonic power that it's lost over the past 40 years.
Yeah, so the U.S. is not going to have the same degree of primacy or hegemony or advantage, or whatever word you want to use, that it did in 1945 or that it did in 1991. Those days are gone. But let me offer a variation. The U.S. share of the global economy has not decreased in the last 50 years. It's been quite stable. It's somewhere between 20 and 25% of global GDP, depending on how you measure. It looks pretty clear to me at this point that unless the U.S. really messes up its own economy, the most likely answer to the question of when China will overpass the U.S., the world's largest economy, is never. And so the U.S. is going to have the capacity to shape the international system in a really important way for a long time to come. It's going to need more help, though. And so the question is not sort of, can the U.S. achieve by itself all the things that it wants to achieve? It's, can it round up the posse, the coalition of countries that share enough of its interests so that they can achieve those aims together? And I think the U.S. plus its allies and plus its close security partners is absolutely capable of doing that with the right level of coordination. If you add up the U.S. plus its treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, plus the NATO allies, plus the close security partners, the Saudi Arabias of the world and things like that, it's still an overwhelming concentration of power. And so the key is whether the U.S. is going to be good enough and effective enough to convene those coalitions and summon common effort. And I think that's an area where I actually worry quite a lot at some of the trends I see in U.S. foreign policy, because that's going to be the fundamental enabler of American effectiveness in the years ahead.
Hello, my name is Amit. I'm a senior in the college. Something that is kind of a common belief that you've both referenced, albeit in different ways, is the idea that the American-led world order since 1945 has been at least nominally values-based, and we're now moving into something that's more transactional or perhaps disorder, depending on how you want to call it. Do you each believe that America has actually led with values, or that that's just something on paper or something that's been claimed? And if so, why or why not?
I mean, I do think that the United States has tried to lead with values. They believe the United States, I mean, there's this debate, of course, whether the rules-based order, liberal world order ever existed. I would say it didn't, not to the fullest extent that people think it did. But I would also say that the idea of human rights, the idea of the U.S. as an exceptional nation motivated many policymakers and continues to motivate policymakers. And it's what distinguishes us, I would argue, from other nations who do foreign policy, like China. So China doesn't have a democracy, human rights sort of based foreign policy. But then implied to that question is, of course, like, do we live up to that? And I would say often no, right? And I think that's where the problem lies, is that the discrediting of a rules-based international order is, I think, accelerated, or has been accelerated in recent years. And I think that's something that we have to come to terms with as a nation, and as national security officials think about foreign policy going forward. It's like, how do you actually try to rethink values and adhere to values, your values, in a multipolar world without sacrificing security or regions to imperial or autocratic leaders. It's a big question, and I don't know if Hal's any more brilliant on it. But
I think I agree with Mike on this. And I would say, the United States has long thought of its values as something that shape its interests, right? And so American leaders, going back a long, long way, even before the 1940s, but particularly from the 1940s onward, have believed in general that a more humane, more democratic world will be better for the United States because it will be populated by countries that sort of look like the United States, politically, and other countries that are committed to having an international system, a world in which liberal values, sort of classically liberal values, can thrive. And then the question becomes sort of how do you implement that in an imperfect world where you always have to make moral trade-offs, or you frequently have to make moral trade-offs? And the answer is you implement it very imperfectly, right? And so you may think that we're trying to work towards a more democratic world in general, but then there's a communist movement that takes control of Guatemala through electoral means, and so you say, okay, we're going to try to overthrow that government instead. Or you do it and you overreach, as was the case in American policy sometimes during the 1990s and the 2000s. And so the question of sort of how you integrate your values into your statecraft on a day-to-day basis, I think has always been incredibly complicated. And it gives the United States a reputation, which is sometimes well-earned, for hypocrisy, right? That we talk about our values, but we can't always live them. But I would just say, I think if you care about democracy, if you care about human rights, if you care about the set of values that are associated with those things, you'd probably rather have a system that is led by a democratic superpower that has a flawed conscience, but a conscience nonetheless, than one that has no conscience or no principles or a very different set of principles in its place.
Thank you both for joining us today. My name is David. I'm a sophomore in the college. I think kind of like pivoting to a more traditional understanding of U.S. global order and the sort of discussion of the U.S. military presence, particularly within Europe, and then also now sort of within the South China Sea and Africa in sort of anti-insurgency movements. How do you see the U.S. military presence maintaining order, like physically, particularly against and non-state actors like insurgency movements like we see across the Middle East and most of sort of Eastern Africa and the sub-Saharan region?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. I mean, I think when it comes to insurgency, terrorism, other forms of extremism, really the role that the United States has tried to play with some degree of effectiveness, let's say since the early 2010s, is not trying to solve problems, just to prevent them from getting much, much worse. And so if you think about, U.S. military involvement in Africa, what is it? Like, it is very minimal at this point. It is, a few dozen trainers in a handful of different countries, maybe with some other forces over the horizon, trying to work with local security forces so they're not totally overwhelmed by the jihadist movements that are running rampant in much of the Sahel and other parts of the region. It's very much sort of an economy of force, mowing the grass type approach to dealing with extremism. It's inherently frustrating until you compare it to some of the alternatives, right? And so would you rather have a much heavier footprint U.S. military presence in Africa, trying to be more active in stamping out jihadist threats? Or would you rather have no U.S. presence at all, in which case local governments are probably going to struggle even more to deal with jihadist threats, or turn to Russian mercenaries or others who will pledge to help them with that, but often end up making the problem worse? So it's an inherently unsatisfying situation, but the alternatives are pretty unsatisfying as well.
Hi, my name is Sherry Huang. I'm a freshman in the college, and I know that a lot of global power comes from the ability to mediate between conflicts, and that there are a lot of critics accusing Western powers of imposing their values or norms on non-Western cultures. And I was wondering if you would think it would be necessary or beneficial for these adjudication systems to switch to a more regional system, like for example during the Bandung Conference, and what the world would look like if it was more regional styles of governance rather than this one unilateral power.
I think we're headed in that direction. I think that's where we're going. Is that you're going to have regional powers sort out regional issues, and then as much as the current president enjoys symmetry, I'm skeptical that symmetry will lead to bilateral or even multilateral symmetry will lead to resolving conflicts of the kind you're referencing. And so what then happens, I think, is that and this is sort of my concern with the transactionalism that we see predominant, I think, now or increasing in global affairs, is that you're going to have a series of mediations that might work for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 years or 4 years, but that's actually not going to create a global framework for resolving conflicts or thinking about the role of great powers and small powers and where global order fits in terms of creating or rectifying the conditions that created those conflicts in the first place. Instead of stamping out the conflicts, creating a ceasefire, how do we deal with the fact that we should never have these conflicts to begin with? And I think that's where global order can play a role, where the grand strategic picture can come into the fore. But my concern is that that's increasingly unlikely to be the case going forward.
I'll maybe just offer one thought on this. I agree with Mike that I think that is in some ways where we're headed, but we should be very clear about what that means, right? And so if you have a regional order, the regional order is going to be dominated or led, and the norms are going to be set by the region's most powerful, most active state. And so when you think about what sort of the norms of a Russian order in the former Soviet Union are going to look like, that they're not going to look like flourishing democracy and freedom of choice for key countries and respect for human rights. They're going to look very different. If you think about what those norms are going to look like in an Asia, even a mainland Southeast Asia that is dominated by China, it's going to be a much more illiberal system of values and norms than we have become used to. And so that might lead to a more balanced world. This is sometimes the argument that the people who talk about spheres of influence and why they might be a good thing would make, but it's just important to be very clear that that world is going to be very different and in some ways a lot nastier than the one that we've inhabited.
Hi, my name is Oliver. I'm a resident of the city of New Haven. And my question is, if American power is necessary, how would you address the severe decline in military enlistment and manufacturing's dependence on extremely fragile supply lines for war material? So this is a question for both of you.
Well,
you want to go first?
I mean, as you said, military recruitment has suffered and declined in recent years. It's a problem the military has tried to confront. I think the larger issue of recruitment is bound up in the bigger question of what is the role in military, what is the role of the military in the United States, and what role does the military play in terms of providing benefits, providing what one historian has even called the welfare state, a military welfare state. What ultimately incentivizes people to join up and participate in and sign up for military service when there doesn't seem to be a crisis like 9/11, which is the last time we saw sort of major recruitment in the military. And I think then your question indicates sort of a long-term problem. It's like, well, if you don't have the military capabilities, or you don't have the people enlisting in the military, then you have a larger problem of what ultimately is going to happen to the U.S. military going forward. And I would argue then this is part of the larger structural limitations we're going to be facing as a country in terms of how we think about our military power. I think Hal would agree with me, we don't want to see a crisis like 9/11 spur people to the military or to join the military. And I don't see that happening, hopefully, anytime soon. So then the question is, what ultimately does the military provide? What role does the military provide in our lives in terms of the ways I specified, the welfare side of things, but also then long-term, 20, 30 years down the road, what does it mean if we have a shrinking military and unable, therefore, to carry out our commitments to abroad and at home to a certain extent?
So I think the recruitment issue and the defense industrial base issue are both important, but in some ways they're two different issues.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, the recruitment numbers have looked significantly better over the last year than they did in the last few years before that. And there's a debate about why that is and whether it's just a blip or it's a longer term trend. The other thing to keep in mind is that military recruitment tends to be counter-cyclical, right? The military does well in attracting people when the job market's bad. It does poorly when the job market's good. And we've basically lived in a red-hot jobs market for the past 15 years in the United States, which makes it hard for the military to attract folks. I'm not rooting for like a recession that will improve military recruitment, but that's just kind of an empirical trend we've seen. On the defense industrial base side, this is an area where I probably agree in part with what Mike would consider a critique, which is one of the reasons the U.S. has a fragile defense industrial base is that the U.S. took a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War and kind of never stopped taking it, even as it continued to do very ambitious things in the world, and even as conventional military threats have sort of come back on stage in the past 10 to 15 years. And so if you were to pose the question as, can the United States live up to all its military commitments around the world while spending 3.2% of GDP on defense? I think the answer is no. Like, I think it's going to have to be closer to 4% or 4.5%. Now that's a lot of money that we're talking about, and that money has to come from somewhere. And so if Americans want to keep this foreign policy, and they want to keep the defense strategy that goes with it, you're not going to be able to do so on the cheap forever. And so ultimately, the United States is going to have a more searching sort of national conversation about what is it that we really prioritize in terms of our expenditures and in terms of our revenues in the years ahead.
Just a really quick two-finger, if I can. The defense industrial base, I think what's also happened, and I agree with what Hal's saying to a certain extent, but the defense industrial base has not invested in the types of things that would help us win wars in Ukraine for the past 30 years. So we've invested in like big ticket items like F-35s, but in terms of dealing with the types of conflicts we'll see in the future, we haven't. That's been a larger problem. I think that needs to be addressed.
I agree with that.
Hi, my name is Nurse, and I am a first-year grad student in the Department of Political Science. I'm from India, and I wanted to ask you, so what I understand, Dr. Brenes, you're saying that the global order needs US, and what you're saying, Dr. Brenes, is that yes, it does, but it does have, the globe has other powers as well, which is India and China. And I wanted to ask you about the domestic challenges that the US is facing right now and how that is shaping that global order. For example, the attack on immigrants, the attack on universities, domestic extremism, racism, the polarized public that we have, human rights issues, how it's pushing away its own allies globally, the European allies, and also the African and Asian allies. So it's sort of lost that trust and in the world as the world used to see it, and we agree on that. But then how do you see the domestic forces shaping the global order and how US behaves in that global order?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I think the question kind of answers itself, and I would say that I agree with a significant portion of the critique. I think the U.S. has done a lot of things that have been damaging to American interests, whether that's sort of undercutting its own innovation ecosystem or, now we're talking about significant limits on high-skilled immigration, which is going to be a competitive disadvantage for the United States. And you can go on down the list, and I think most of that stuff is unhelpful for American power and by extension for the order that the United States has tried to support. In terms of the issue of trust, the good news or the bad news, depending on your perspective, is that the U.S. has a significant reservoir of goodwill out there in the world, and it's not always because of things the U.S. government does. It's because people like American movies and they like American products and so on and so forth. And so you can look at this in a negative sense, in the sense that the U.S. can get away with irresponsible or atrocious behavior for longer than other countries can because it has this reservoir and it has these other advantages, or you can look at it as a good thing in the sense that even when the United States is behaving badly and not constructively, most countries around the world are extremely reluctant to sort of call it and say, okay, we're no longer going to be buddies with the United States, because they hope that the democratic system will correct itself and you will get a reversion to an America that they're more comfortable with in the future. So I think that has been actually a major source of American longevity in international affairs over the past 80 years.
All right, and with that, we will now move on to closing statements from each of our guests, starting with Dr. Brenes.
Yeah, so I'm out of good points, and I'm deep into my bad points at this point. So rather than sort of litigate any of this further, I'm just going to use my remaining 107 seconds to say thank you. Thanks to Mike. It's always fun to kind of debate these issues together. But thanks even more so to the Buckley folks for putting this on. I think this is exactly the sort of forum that we need in our country and in our world right now, where we can talk about really complicated, controversial issues in a sort of calm and engaged way. And thanks to all of you for coming out and spending time with us and contributing to the conversation with your questions as well.
Yeah, I would just say ditto. Thank you all for coming on a rainy Thursday. Thank you for, again, the Buckley Institute. Thanks to Will again. Thanks to Jack. I couldn't agree more with Hal. This is this type of conversation. It's been more of a conversation, I think, a debate. These types of conversations, I think, are very needed, and we need to have more of them, particularly at a time like now when the old order is dying and a new one is emerging. I think there are lots of opportunities or questions about where the United States and where the world goes, and it's great to hash them out with my friend Hal Brands. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to Hal.
Thank you all so much for coming. That was a really great debate. If you could join me in one final thank you for our guests.